On this episode of China Unscripted, the Chinese Communist Party is at the center of an international criminal conspiracy involving money laundering, drug trafficking, and espionage. And it's all going down in Canada? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
And this episode is sponsored by Daily Peanut. The news can be a tough pill to swallow. That's why Daily Peanut gives you a daily dose of news in equal parts humor and substance. The link is in the description. And joining us today is Sam Cooper. He's an award-winning Canadian investigative journalist and author of the new book, Wilful Blindness: How a Network of Narcos, Tycoons, and CCP Agents Infiltrated the West. All right, Sam, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely. So in your new book, Wilful Blindness, you kind of talk about this reverse Opium War, in a way, that China is waging against the West. So for context, broadly speaking, what's happening?
That quote, the reverse Opium War, actually came from a very good law enforcement source that really helped me stand up some of the findings with documentation. And the observation was, for students of history, they know that the gentleman traders, as I call them, from Scotland, Jardine and Matheson, were involved in shipping tea from China to the West and making their money. But as I say, they made their fortunes bringing the opium into Hong Kong and Canton. And really through corruption, they enriched people there. They got very rich. And after, the local population started to suffer, Chinese authorities in those days started to take it seriously and pushed back on the British. And this led to the Opium Wars, where the Summer Palace was ransacked. I won't carry on the history lesson too long. Everyone knows it. But this led to what the Chinese Communist Party calls the 100 years of humiliation. This is in their propaganda now. And you can almost, I would say, some people would say that there are people in Beijing that aren't really that sad that fentanyl is racking Western cities. And so this is an observation from law enforcement or intelligence that at a high level, China is making huge money from fentanyl. It's made in the factories. It's coming west. They could stop it if they wanted to, but they're not. So what's the problem here? And as I dug into the book, got deeper into my research, I found that as hard as it is for Westerners to believe, there is a level of direction at a high level in the Chinese state of these transnational narcotics cartels. There is, whether it's corruption, offering protection at a high level to drug traffickers that are making money and cycling it back in trade-based money laundering to China, or whether there's actual intent, and that would be, Chinese intelligence operatives happy that Western cities are suffering deaths from fentanyl and China is making money. Some of these questions are still open, but to me, it is proven beyond doubt that at high levels in China, there's corruption where officials are involved with fentanyl cartels and in some cases giving direction. I'll finish up by saying, some of the more aggressive intelligence analysts or people from the DEA have already made the case that Hezbollah, which is essentially an Iranian state-sponsored crime, does use drugs to weaken Western cities. And these same people would say that China is doing the same. I haven't gotten there exactly yet, but I do think that China is complicit. There's an omission of enforcement. So you could say it's a type of war in reverse.
It's funny that you say that people are shocked that maybe the Chinese Communist Party knows about this. Maybe they're behind it in some ways. Because, if you look back at the Opium War, there was definitely high-level government involvement in that. But, there's no way China could be doing that today. It's almost as if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it.
I say that from the perspective, and I get into this in the book, that in some ways I was still a product of my Canadian or Western education. We are taught that governments don't deal with weapons traffickers, drug traffickers. But, and I don't think in the modern era in the West they do. Maybe setting aside some very, black ops involving some intelligence agencies. There's not too much interaction. But for me, it was a mental leap to get to the point where what my sources were saying is that at a high level within the party in Beijing, there is this direction of drug cartels. And again, I found in my book, Canadian police wiretaps established in a way this fact during a triad war that was rocking Macau and spilled over into Vancouver. Yes, Canadian police heard on a wiretap an official in China directing essentially a truce among triads. So for me, I always say I'm not American. My father told me sort of that I'm from Missouri. You got to show me before I believe it. Don't just tell me. And I found the evidence for my own eyes. But you're right. For students of history to understand that at a high level, corruption does occur between state leaders and crime lords. Yeah, it's not too much of a leap once you dig in.
And you said something just now that was very interesting. There was a triad war in Macau that spilled over to Canada. How? They're not quite next to each other.
They're not next, but what I tell people that I stumbled or backed into this high-level geopolitical espionage story by looking at casino money laundering. And in Vancouver, the level of money laundering, we're talking about, narcos, movies, hockey bags of cash for the Canadians that'll be watching this audience. This show. We've got $1 million, at the low end, $100,000 in $20 bills coming into a casino. And so this is drug money laundering that was allowed by BC government casinos. So why was that happening? I discovered that back in 1997, the government raised betting limits in BC casinos, which had been very low, and they introduced the game of baccarat, which is the favored form of gambling for Chinese economic fugitives, high-level party operatives in Macau. So this is Macau money laundering that was happening, for a long time between China, where gambling is illegal, Macau and Hong Kong. This is how corrupt officials get their money out of China by using loan sharks and gangsters. And then this was transplanted onto the west coast of Canada. So that is how Macau style, or what is called in Canada now, the Vancouver model of money laundering is actually the Macau model. And that's really a big theme of my book.
Could you just walk us through how that system works, how the Vancouver model works of money laundering?
Yes, I say it's incredibly complex, but incredibly simple in another way. In a simple explanation, as we know, citizens of China have a capital export limit of $50,000 per year. We also know that at the top end in China, it's a lot of corrupt officials and people that have gotten rich through corruption that have the majority of the capital in China. So many of them want to get that money out. They can't do it legally with those export controls, so they have to go to organized crime. This is the Macau or Vancouver model. What you do is you go to your local gangster in Shenzhen, Wuhan, Shanghai, and you say, I need to get money to New York City, Vancouver, Melbourne. I'm going to put down, the equivalent of $100,000 US. It's put into the underground criminal bank in Wuhan. And you say, I'm going to travel to Las Vegas or Richmond's River Rock Casino or Crown Resorts in Australia. And a gangster is going to meet me in a parking lot near the casino and pay me out my funds. So that, in simple terms, you put a credit down in China and you travel west, whatever city or casino, and get paid out. You gamble, and we could go on and on and on. But in simple terms, for it to work so brazenly in Vancouver, they literally would allow people to carry in a hockey bag with $500,000 to $1 million in $20, bricks of 10,000, $20 bills, buy your casino chips with no problem. And then you cash out in a higher denomination or a check. And you can see quite easily, once you have a check, you put a down payment on a home. It could be just a a rundown little shack in Vancouver that would still cost you $2 million, but you start laundering and more drug money to renovate it up into a mansion, and that's how you launder money Vancouver style.
So you're saying the local authorities, the Vancouver authorities, know about this?
Absolutely. Again, as hard as it is for us to believe, and for me to believe as a Canadian, I thought we were an upright, law-abiding country. The authorities knew clearly. The police knew, the government ministers knew, the regulators knew, everyone from the casino cash cage to the VIP host who treated that traveler from Beijing like a king when he came into the VIP salon. Everyone involved at every step in the way in BC knew, or should have known, not should have known, they knew that this money was coming from loan sharks. And what's a loan shark? They're called cash facilitators in the sanitized BC government language. These are people that beat their customers if they don't get paid back in time. The customers, in order to secure their loans, they'll sign over, the pink slip or the ownership papers to their Mercedes, to their home. The loan shark will know where their daughter goes to private school. These debts are enforced by killers, and BC's government knew and did nothing for years.
Well, this confirms that my opinion about Canada has been right all these years. So how does the drug trafficking tie into this? Because what you've said right now just kind of describes like money laundering, but there's also drugs.
Right. So this comes back to these underground banks, which, it's not limited, of course, to mainland China citizens. We see this ancient form of banking. It's known as Hawala in the Middle East. It exists in many cultures, but it's a huge form of underground banking and finance in China because, as my hosts know, that there's a big distrust of the government in there among citizens of China and the people that control them, the authoritarians. There's distrust there. So people are very used to hiding their assets or the fear that they'll be taken away willy-nilly. So the underground banking, the Chinese citizens, whether they're a corrupt official, a drug trafficker, or a computer programmer, for them to get some security outside China, they must use that organized crime bank. Those banks are built on decades of heroin wealth. This is organized crime at a very, deep and powerful level. And it's run essentially through family banks, or, at a high level, you could compare them to mafia banks in other cultures. It's very family related. So the bank in Wuhan is related to the bank in Richmond. On both sides, it's drug money, deep, deep, deep pockets of criminal money. But that what could be legitimate money in China that needs to get out is facilitated by the drug banks. So you put the credit down in China, you arrive in Richmond, and you're getting paid out with cash drug money. You have to have professionals that will launder that money. You have to have the casinos that will look the other way, the real estate industry that will look the other way. But that money is going on a loop back to China to fund more drug imports. That's where that opium war in reverse comes in. So really the drug money, I call it, it's almost like it's fluid. It's a leverage to get money of all types around the world moving, and it facilitates the shipment of drugs around the world.
Just for some broader context for our audience, we talk a lot on the show about the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare, that the Communist Party considers itself at war with the West. And drug warfare is a big aspect of this. And it's funny because last week we had on the show Rosemary Gibson, who wrote a book called China RX. And she was mentioning that, while all of this Chinese fentanyl is winding up in the United States, I don't know what the fentanyl situation is in Canada off the top of my head. But so while there's this opioid epidemic being fueled by Chinese drugs, at the same time, China controls a lot of the global medical supply chain and has been cutting back on the amount of medicine that you give people having overdoses. They've been cutting back on that. So you kind of see like this multifaceted drug warfare that you can't really, like as you were saying earlier, it's hard for us to imagine that our governments would be doing something like this. So how could the Chinese government be doing something like that? But the reality is, this is warfare.
At some level, I have seen enough to judge that through omission of enforcement, through corruption, that is, officials that regulate and could shut the fentanyl precursor factories down at a moment's notice if they wanted to, but are making so much money from the pharmaceutical industry. And through corruption, we know some of them are making so much money from the illicit fentanyl industry. It doesn't matter. All of those channels are profitable to China. So if they were good faith partners with, Western governments, if they weren't involved in something, whether you call it gray zone conflict, asymmetric war, unrestricted war, people are comfortable with different levels of terminology. But what is occurring and what cannot be denied is there's a conflict that is below armed conflict, but there are strategic elements to it. I'm one that I don't always judge that the people over in Beijing have everything all figured out. They make mistakes. There's so many actors involved, many self-interested, that it would be hard to see just a computer level efficiency to this gray zone or asymmetric warfare. But it's occurring. And again, I come back to the point of what I call sort of my more aggressive sort of intelligence analyst sources do say, if Hezbollah wants to harm the West using drugs, it's not a huge leap to judge that some in China may as well.
And now you also mentioned this, which is just, it's like you pulled a thread and so many things came unraveled. This also ties into the what's happening with the real estate market in Vancouver, driving up the housing prices. And I imagine that's making a lot of residents there upset.
It is. And you said that you're not exactly sure what the fentanyl situation is in Canada. I can tell you that compared to West Virginia, Vancouver is the second highest level of harm in North America. I used to report from the epicenter. That's the downtown, the east side in Vancouver. Again, as a Canadian, I would never have thought that I could see such a place with such literally war zone type conditions of addicts so devastated by heroin and fentanyl. And yes, in the book, I found that, look, Chinese transnational cartels have a very strong base of operations, especially in cities like Vancouver and Toronto. They're making so much money. This underground banking that I'm describing that both facilitates a huge flow of money from China, some of it legitimate, some of it illegitimate, but all mixed in with organized crime underground banking. That money is just bursting to the surface in Vancouver. So the illicit money is mixing in with the licit, the banks, the casinos. I'm not going to call them licit. They've proven themselves to be illicit businesses. Currency exchanges are entirely corrupted in some areas of Vancouver. And this has to have a major effect on Vancouver real estate prices. My example or my data point here is this has led through some of my reporting to a commission of inquiry into money laundering in BC, led by a BC high-level judge. And in his interim report, he said, money laundering is a huge problem in Vancouver. It's tearing the fabric of democracy and society. We haven't heard his final report yet, but what I judge from that, because I reported on these issues, is hot money, when it comes in large volumes into a city, it chases out good money. It raises the real estate prices. And so the businesses, the good businesses, the citizens that are working hard to pay taxes, save for their children's university, they're being pushed out of the center of this, what we have to call a narco hub city. And that people are up in arms, and they should be about that.
You wouldn't really think of Vancouver as a narco hub city.
You wouldn't. There's so many ironies and mind-blowing findings for me in the process of reporting this book. And it's true. I had to go back and look at how what we call the Tycoons of Hong Kong started to buy large portions of Vancouver real estate in the late 80s. This coincided with the arrival of triads that are very related to the Tycoons and a flow in of heroin. And that the real estate and the drug money can't be separated in my analysis.
So just again, a lot of these casinos, they're not just privately run casinos. A lot of them are run by the government, correct?
These are BC Lottery Corporation casinos. And it's shocking that a government casino, again, I tell people in Las Vegas and Macau, the jurisdictions much larger, much more known for casino activity, you could not have that brazen level of drug money laundering going into those casinos. They have credit systems. They're in some ways, I'm not going to say Macau is not more connected to organized crime, because there's more organized crime in Macau, but still, you can't have the appearance of a hockey bag of 20s or whatever the relevant currency is in Macau going into the casino. They're a little bit more, I would say, smart than the officials in BC. And yes, these are casinos that my research showed once the game Baccarat and higher bet limits were introduced in 1997, that coincided very well with the arrival of the triads from Macau and Hong Kong, and the money laundering that was accepted by the local police and BC government just rose exponentially from that point. And I tell people I never stop being shocked at the brazenness of the criminality that infiltrated the casinos in BC.
The number of people that must have their fingers in the pie is insane.
It's insane. And how can I say that? I have well-placed police intelligence sources, well-placed civilian intelligence sources. I have documents myself that say that the transnational organized crime kingpins brag of their special relationships with Canadian officials. I'm aware of high-level reports which point to widespread corruption in BC, and I believe them. I believe what I see with my eyes, and that is Vancouver. To pull the camera out, this is the capital of supercars in North America. It's not a capital of finance, legitimate finance. It's a city of empty condos, McLarens, Lamborghinis, and Ferraris, and casinos run by the government and really run by organized crime, I believe, at some level.
Well, so Sam, why are your sources coming to you? I mean, you're a great guy, Sam, but why aren't they screaming this from the tallest mountain?
There's probably 2, 3, maybe even 10 answers to that. But I would say for the American friends, Canada is a society that's really built on privacy and politeness, and that is leveraged by nefarious actors. There's a big, I come back to, we have the education and expectation that Canada is an upright country. But what my reporting and some others has shown is that it has become a home for transnational crime because there's such privacy, because law enforcement in some ways is inhibited from cracking down on some of the most wealthy and powerful transnational narcos in the world. So why are they not screaming? They will lose their jobs. I'll give you a quick example. In my book and in this commission of inquiry I've talked about, an RCMP investigator in 2012 came out and said, the casinos are accepting bags with $500,000. They're not even reporting it as suspicious. They're just recording it as a large cash transaction. He went on to say, any average person on the street can tell you something stinks about that, and yet it's still occurring. We believe sophisticated organized crime is using BC casinos. What happened? He got his hand slapped by the minister responsible for gaming in BC, and it appears that his superiors, who, by the way, believed his story, told him or others, don't speak out again. So there's your answer.
This is like the next Narcos or something, right? Like, how is this not a Netflix TV show?
Narcos Canada.
Yeah.
Someday.
It is Narcos Canada. And I tell you, you ask, why did they come to me? I've been, when I was sort of a younger reporter in Vancouver and trying to understand why people from my generation couldn't afford a home, I started looking for the reasons. I had to understand that offshore money coming in. It was a sensitive topic in Vancouver because, again, perhaps Canadians are more politically correct, and powerful interests in the city said, it would be xenophobic or the R word, I say, point to another country and say, a large amount of money is coming from said other country and influencing local real estate prices. You can't say that. I'm one that I was going to take the slings and arrows and say, I'm sorry. I was taught that the truth is the truth. And we're a multicultural country. I have friends from all backgrounds, and the truth has to be reported. So as I put story after story together, some of these people in government that may have felt muzzled or may have felt the media was muzzled, then started to deliver more confidential documents.
So you're preparing for the accusations of racism?
I'm not preparing. I'm well accustomed to the accusations. My book, in the latter chapters, gets into, and again, I'll say, not to paint myself as a victim, but the chapter is called Strike Back Hard, and I showed that safety masks during the pandemic were collected at an industrial scale through Chinese consulates across Canada, and surprise, some of the people involved in the casino money laundering were very active in those collection and shipping efforts. I did a story showing those connections, and I did face an organized campaign using the R word towards myself, sending petitions out. Ideas were to crowdfund a lawsuit against myself for some sort of hate. And none of it was, let me just say the lawsuit was not successful, but those attempts to silence critics of, first of all, the regime in China, and to try to make it look as if they're coming from a dark place, can be very successful in inhibiting investigative reporting or the media in Canada, and I'm afraid other countries, but Canada seems to be very susceptible to it.
Well, hold on. I got to touch on something there. You talked about, it's known now that the Chinese Communist Party covered up the coronavirus and used those weeks to hoard medical supplies from around the world. You're saying the local government was involved in helping China hoard those medical supplies?
No, I'm saying that my investigation showed that some of the people that are involved in United Front activity, as you know, this is China's foreign sort of interference efforts to control diaspora communities. Some of those people were, of course, involved with the Chinese consulates in gathering the PPE. And I showed that some of the casino actors, or to use the right word, a high-level loan shark, was involved. I showed the connections between the Chinese Communist Party, the United Front, and organized crime suspects, and how these people were involved in PPE networks and connected in various ways. And so I'm not saying the Canadian government was involved in any way. I'm saying that China, using the United Front, was involved. And I would say my story, at least according to a Canadian security intelligence former veteran, was probably the first time in Canada this network had been exposed to such a level. And as my book explains, there was an effort to strike back hard against that investigative reporting.
I mean, I guess if you have this underground network that's being used to funnel money and drug money, why not use that to funnel, PPE back to China? You're at least a patriotic drug lord. I
mean, it doesn't even sound like it's that underground.
No, that's true too.
Well, no, but I mean, that's an excellent point. This is all about, I have to hammer this. It's not just about drug money. The drug money, the organized crime becomes, just like a bank. It becomes a trade network. It is so interrelated with factories in China, with shipping in China, that it's a channel of, sending safety masks. You cannot, again, this is a point I make in the book, because of this corruption, in some ways, you cannot separate large portions of China's economy from organized crime. So, of course, it makes sense that if they're very active in British Columbia, you can't separate real estate and casinos from organized crime, because those are the most, apparently used vectors of this underground or, almost above ground form of finance.
You talk in the book also about the fact that Vancouver as a port city is very useful to these drug cartels or these loan sharks, the underground banks. And then you also talk about human trafficking that comes through. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And just a quick data point. 2 weeks ago, a fentanyl super lab was busted by the Canadian Federal Police in just a suburb of Vancouver that's very related to the areas I'm investigating. Police said that it could produce 10 million fatal doses of fentanyl per week.
Whoa.
10 million. That's enough to kill a third of the Canadians. And this gets to my point that the precursors coming in from factories in China are pressed up in labs, whether they're in mansions, single homes, or warehouses. Vancouver has become a crucial hub for that fentanyl production and a transshipment point. And so people that are watching this interview in United States, Japan, Australia, have to look at Canada for responsibility. The city of Toronto suburbs, the suburbs in Vancouver are very responsible for sending fentanyl around the world. The port of Vancouver, just like ports on the coast of Mexico, are important both for trade coming in and for fentanyl precursors coming in and for this underground banking cycling of money going out. So if we're talking about ships, we're talking about legitimate trade items, we're talking about precursors hidden in the bowels of the ships. And of course, sometimes we're talking about humans being trafficked as well from the southern coast of China. It's a big issue. What I call the fentanyl kingpins, these would be the people that are bigger than El Chapo ever was, the people that are making the most money off of heroin and fentanyl. They have been most responsible for human trafficking into Canada's west coast. And many of these people would be, people trying to get a better life. Some of them underage women that are trafficked into prostitution. This is it's all dark, but when you're talking about underage females, some of them with gambling debts being trafficked into Canadian cities and then south in the United States, it gets even more dark.
I know there's been a movement to label the Chinese Communist Party as a transnational criminal organization. And just the more and more I hear, that seems like a very accurate label.
There's a very, I believe his name is Garneau, a very, respected journalist in Australia that spent a lot of time in China. I believe he's made a similar observation, if not exactly the same, that at a high level in the party, those connections to organized crime, to triads, are very strong. Therefore, is it that much of a leap to compare them? Some would put Russia in the same category of, if there's that level of collusion, it's a racket. The gangsters in the racket, the officials in the racket, they're all in the same racket. Is the Politburo involved in organized crime? I can't say it that blankly, but we can say that people from the Politburo have been involved with loan sharks and organized crime.
I mean, if you go specifically back to the origins of the Chinese Communist Party, what Mao Zedong had said, and he said it, he wrote it, that what we, the Communist Party, want is for the scum of society to take the lead in creating a China run by the Communist Party. In other words, he was recruiting criminals, or what he called the scum of society, to be part of the upper echelon of the party, because he needed those people in order to do things like kill the landlords and suppress the intellectuals and infiltrate the KMT so that his Chinese Communist Party could gain power. So if that's how the Communist Party started, it's not that big a leap to think that these elements have continued to play a role for the last 70 years that they've been in power.
I agree. And David Mulrooney, Canada's former ambassador to China, I always rely on authority when making, when putting paragraphs in a book. And I went to him and asked, can it be true that the party used organized crime in Hong Kong, used the United Front to expand? And he said, there's no denying the connection from the earliest days, as you say, of the party till now. The Chinese Communist Party will co-opt and use any tool for their ends. And how does it work? At a very simple level. If you are a high-level gangster and you face, they want you to go do something in Australia, Vancouver, New York, or Toronto, they will get you on a death penalty. It is illegal and you can be killed for dealing drugs in China. So they get that on you and they'll say, well, you want to live, you want your family to live, it's time for you to go abroad. I looked at a case in my book, Lai Changxing, who's a very familiar figure to experts on China, former most wanted man. He says he was sent to Hong Kong and told to report back on the democracy movement and Taiwanese intelligence. He then ran to Canada, and we'd be, I think, naive to believe that he wasn't interrelating with intelligence in some way once he arrived in Vancouver, even though he was running from the party at that point.
Wow. I mean, just the idea that the Chinese Communist Party at a high level and like their court system and everything is sending their most talented criminals abroad to go do criminal activity, right? It's even worse than what Cuba did when they sent a whole bunch of prisoners they released to Florida. But in that case, they were just releasing criminals to the United States. Here, it's more like the Chinese Communist Party is releasing criminals and then giving them a specific direction for, gathering intelligence on dissidents or, getting involved in this and that. Like it's an insane level of pushing criminality abroad.
It is. And again, for viewers that are thinking that's a leap too far, look, the FBI said last year, cyber criminals were trying to hack into, world institutions that are trying to, get a vaccine for COVID-19. And organized crime in China was being used to try to hack in and steal that intellectual property. The FBI said China has joined that. I think they said, very, let's just say, shady group of nations that will use organized crime. And so whether it's releasing your most violent and cunning gangsters into other cities and using some of their drug proceeds, whether it's allowing, fentanyl precursors to go other countries without cracking down, or cyber hacking, it is all forms of co-opting and using organized crime.
I mean, last year, the U.S. shut down the Chinese consulate in Houston because they felt it was a center for criminal activity.
There you go. I don't need to say any more. That, the People's Liberation Army operatives, very present in U.S. and Canadian cities. And I show in my book, they're very present in casino networks. And so casinos, real estate, art, those sometimes can be a front for raising money for, more politically aimed activities such as bribes or influence, donations to political parties in the West.
You mentioned art. Can you just explain what you mean by criminals using art?
I look at a well-known, it should be better known case in my book and explain how it helped me to understand this espionage side of the Vancouver model. There's a Macau casino and developer tycoon who allegedly also, a high-level triad boss, was nailed by the FBI on something like $19 million worth of transfers into New York City area. He allegedly had corrupted former head of the United Nations, John Ash, who is not with us anymore, and a related official. The case is that 19 million flows into the United States from abroad. Some of it goes to Las Vegas casinos. Some of it is for art and for real estate, but some of it is used to bribe officials, such as the two UN officials. And so when we're looking at these high-end luxury goods, they're very they can be gray or black markets. They can be good stores of value, but as I said, they could also be, you can look very much like a decadent, corrupt official involved in buying real estate or art in New York City. And at the same time, through the backside, you can be bribing officials, and it's a good cover.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk in the book about how when these kind of like tycoons start coming over, or the triad people start coming over to Canada and they claim refugee status, they say, they're persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party, but then, there's photos of them with consulate officials and with, provincial like BC officials and things like that. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It is, and it's absolute textbook. The Big Circle Boys is the gang that was very related to the Red Guards and became, really probably the most prolific triad outside of China. And almost every case we looked at, or I looked at, when they would land in Canada, they would say, "Oh, I'm for democracy. I had a factory that was printing pro-democracy T-shirts in Guangzhou, and that's why I'm on the run." But as soon as they arrived, they did hook up with consulate figures. One of them, who I point to, joined a pro-democracy society in Vancouver, run by a high-level Canadian politician who just, for some reason, this Canadian politician always seemed to turn up in photos with RCMP suspects. And so what it points to is democracy is used as a billboard. But it's very clear that they're not fans of democracy. They're working with the party in both criminal ways and, my book found, in espionage ways once established in Canada.
Maybe they were just fans of what Mao Zedong referred to as the People's Democratic Dictatorship.
I hadn't heard that slate. I hadn't seen T-shirts of that one either. But they've got a story, and it's almost comical how often they said, "I ran from China because I'm for democracy." And as soon as they arrived, they were found to be working with gangsters and, in some cases, consulate officials.
Well, I think what your book does so well is showing how everything is connected, human trafficking, drug trafficking, espionage. And what kills me is, there's really a very fine line between, triads, PLA, and the Chinese Communist Party itself. And yet, you still have like American or even Taiwanese companies being like, well, we'll do business with this private Chinese company making semiconductors with them. Like that can't be a national security issue. They're private companies.
Totally private company.
That's one that always breaks my head when I try to figure it out. In Canada, the example is, two Canadians were kidnapped. This is state level, hostage diplomacy, and yet there are still people that want to deal with this as if it's a normal state. And my example that I can now tell people is, yes, so you want to set up a trade deal at a high level with a country that is using trade to move, money, illicit money, to human traffic, and for some, through corruption, to facilitate drug trafficking around the world. And it all winds together with the whole ball of wax trade, is infected by this dealing with criminality.
Are the, high-level Canadian elected officials who are doing this, are they doing it because they're just ignorant, or is there more to it?
Some of them have to be corrupted. Some of them have to be undeclared agents of foreign states. Look, my book explains the case of what's believed to be the worst, if not one of the worst, intelligence breaches in Canadian history. We have the RCMP's former head of intelligence for the whole national force, who was basically, helping the highest level money launderers and gangsters in the world evade detection, according to the allegations. This is Canada's top police intelligence official, allegedly enriching himself from gangsters, money launderers. My sources asked the question, could he have been misdirecting Canada's federal police force from investigating Chinese organized crime, Chinese corruption, Chinese influence? The same with Iran. So that points to one case of what looks like a very high-level compromise. And I looked at a number of politicians in the book that do appear, we'll say that they don't appear to be acting in Canada's interest. So whose are they acting in?
It breaks my heart because when I think of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, I think of due south.
Dudley Do Right.
Yeah.
That's what I think of. Well, so what does this mean for the Five Eyes Security Alliance?
if you talk to some of my more cynical sources, they would say that Canada, again, I hate to say it, is in a bad position because it has become a bit of a weak link. I think everyone to this point, not everyone, people that are watching closely would say that New Zealand would be probably the most endangered of infiltration concerns, that they were starting to hew a little bit toward Beijing and away from the Five Eyes even. Certainly some in Australia feel that way. But I think what my book shows is the danger of compromise in Canada, if not equal, is a concern. And you have to ask the question. The other Five Eyes have said Huawei does not do business in this country. No, they're not going to run 5G because intelligence says that Huawei is a military intelligence firm. We just saw news today that Huawei was declared a military essentially corporation by the U.S. government. So you can't do business with it. The U.S. government goes further and further to blocking a military intelligence vector as they see it, and yet Canada hasn't taken that step at all. So you have to ask why. Is it naivety? Is it ignorance? Or are there some people that could be in a worse position than willful blindness or ignorance?
Well, if Canada, catches these high level, Canadian politician criminals, they should just send them abroad.
Send them to China. Well, yeah, no, I wouldn't wish that on. We laugh, but there's a person who was a tycoon who was in a hotel in Hong Kong. He was, according to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and everyone at a high level, taken in the cover of darkness. His female bodyguards were overpowered by Chinese intelligence, and he's somewhere in China. We don't know if he's dead or alive. He wasn't only a Chinese citizen; he's also a citizen of Canada and I believe Antigua. So I wouldn't wish that on anyone. I hope we can find out if he's alive someday. His name is Zhao Jianhua.
Yeah, I remember we did an episode about him, and the thing that stuck out to me is that he had decided that he only wanted female bodyguards.
Right, that guy.
Yeah, I think that influenced the thumbnail decision, which influenced how many views it gets. So I know what the thumbnail for this episode is going to be. And Shelley hates me.
Well, okay. I want to ask Sam about, you mentioned New Zealand and Australia briefly and the Five Eyes. A lot of the things that you talk about happening in Vancouver sound very familiar in other parts of the world, like Melbourne with the real estate money. When we were in New Zealand 2 years ago, and Auckland was also crazy in this way where it seemed like there was a lot of money flowing in. Do you have a sense of whether...
And we couldn't get any New Zealand politician to speak to us.
That's true too. Like there was just, when we were in Australia, like Australian politicians were starting to speak out about Chinese Communist Party influence in Australia. In New Zealand, it was just like nobody wanted to talk about it. Do you get the sense that this Vancouver model that you talked about is being implemented in other parts of the world?
Without a doubt. Australia and Vancouver, so Melbourne and Vancouver, the pool of whale gamblers, organized crime is it's not exactly the same, but my research showed that many of the whale gamblers active in Vancouver were of course active in the Australian casinos. We saw bombshell investigative reporting out of Australia, I believe Nick McKenzie, who I cite in the book, showing where a relative of Xi Jinping had flown into Australia to gamble. Junkets connected to organized crime were also connected to sex trafficking, also connected to political influence, also connected to the United Front. We're facilitating that activity in Australia. And of course, it's just, in a different city, it may look a little bit different, but the model is the same. So especially Vancouver and Australia, almost match exactly. New Zealand, I don't think the casinos are quite the same. It may take a different form, but it almost seems the political element of influence is the bigger concern in New Zealand.
Well, I remember in Auckland, there were like junk houses going for $2-3 million, right? And then like at the time, it was kind of like, oh, well, this must just be all the influx of Chinese money. But now I'm like rethinking that as maybe that was actually a lot of it organized crime money that's coming into Auckland as well. But we wouldn't know because no one from the government would talk to us.
They're a little bit more shy than the Canadian officials, but not too much. But you're right. Again, 50,000 export limit is on the China side. For that money to get over to Auckland or Melbourne, the same underground banking and crime model has to be working.
Yeah, there needs to be some way for these rich, corrupt Chinese officials to get their money out of China. Though it is interesting. I'd always thought about that as like these are officials who don't trust the system in China, are afraid of getting taken down some anti-corruption purge, and so they're trying to get their money out of China. But from your book, I get the sense that this is also part of this, asymmetric warfare, unrestricted warfare, that there are reasons why this is happening, not just for some official protecting their own interests or assets.
I think that's exactly right. That is the right conclusion. I come back to saying, China, the Politburo isn't a supercomputer. They make mistakes. So there is corruption. There are so-called naked officials, running away and, sending money to their family members abroad. So corruption is part of it. But let's remember that there is some intentionality. People are sent abroad once they're caught doing something bad in China. Maybe it's time for you to go set up abroad. Don't forget, we have your mother and father are still alive here. So you're going to do what we want you to do. So, of course, the Lai Changxing case, it's a good case in point. He ran away once, news broke of corruption involving the Politburo or very close to the Politburo, but he was involved in intelligence. He was corrupt. He's both at the same time. And I would argue that, that's a good model to look at it. You could be working for Chinese intelligence and be self-interested, different areas of agency. But so what do we draw from that? It's all bad for the West. It may be bad at some time for Beijing. It may be good for sometimes for Beijing.
Do you have a sense of how this is affecting like the Chinese diaspora communities in Vancouver and Canada?
Yes, many of my best sources come from the Hong Kong Canadian or Chinese Canadian communities, and they would say that optimistically, the large majority left because they didn't want anything to do with the party. Now they're living abroad, enjoying democracy, pursuing their dreams. And there's a fear that there's sort of an increasing level of control through the United Front where we can have, people being run by the consulates, surveilling or harassing or meeting in sort of counter protest democracy activists. And I point to a case in my book where people who were just in a church in Vancouver, Hong Kong Canadians praying for peace during that, the real summer of upheaval, 2019 in Hong Kong. And they were surrounded by about 100 people waving large red flags and, very intimidating. These Hong Kong Canadians had to be escorted by police to safety. And they literally, I don't say allegedly, I have the video evidence. There were people with those red flags rushing up and taking their photographs when they left the church. So the natural fear is these photos are going to be used, sent back to the consulate so that we can use them and leverage family members in Hong Kong or in mainland China. So I would say that there's a conflict in the diaspora where you have people that say they're for democracy, they're for the country where they live. And there is a significant, hopefully minority. Well, I mean, I hope it's not growing beyond a minority of people that are very supportive of the party and are being used by the party. So this is playing out in diaspora communities in Canadian cities like Vancouver, Toronto, and I'm sure around the world.
That's just awful to you flee China because you're from Hong Kong or you're, Uyghur or Falun Gong, and then you get surveilled in Canada or in the United States by these party connected people. So you're never really free from that.
it's terrible. We've heard in Canada's government, we have a Canada-China Relations Committee hearing evidence from Uyghurs or Hong Kong Canadian, Chinese Canadian dissidents saying exactly that. They're saying, we don't feel free from surveillance and harassment in our own country. By the way, why don't you block Huawei 5G? You haven't done so yet. That will be used to spy on us. And, the Canada's government is not doing enough. This is the case that they make, my sources in the community make to me. And I think it's fair to say it's I put that argument forward in the book. Not enough is being done in Canada. We know in the United States that they're going after the covert fox hunt operations. We know they're going after the PLA operatives. In Canada, we don't see the evidence of prosecutions. But we do know Canada's Security Intelligence Service is being increasingly public about the risk. And I would say I'm playing the role of an independent, free journalist in sort of getting information from my sources in intelligence and telling a wider spectrum of society about this growing risk in Canada.
Do you see any signs that the federal government is starting to take this more seriously?
It's a hard question because I really wish I could say yes. I can say that, my book has been out for about 1.5 weeks, and I can say that I do sense, a bit of a groundswell of sort of popular acceptance of the book as an engaging, case. And, it's facts and evidence, high-level sources telling a rather incredible story. How can this be happening in Canada? And yet it is. Part of my narrative, again, is, this was hard for me to believe. I had to prove it to myself. I had to go beyond thresholds to be able to write that, yes, the party and organized crime at a high level are working together. And that's a bad thing. It just, I don't think, let me put it this way, at security and intelligence, even, there's a lot of well-meaning and well-read politicians in Canada that have made the case that this is a serious threat to democracy, to society, but we haven't taken the steps in Canada that, for example, Australia or the United States have taken. So what's the holdup in concerning Canada? That's my question.
So what is the solution?
There's a simple solution. Again, nothing is simple, but there's a blueprint in front of Canada's Parliament. The Security and Intelligence Committee has said Australia is an exemplar. Australia and Canada, very comparable in some ways, both with a sort of Anglo-British sort of initial diaspora heritage, and now very, multicultural and cohesive in some ways, and yet under attack in some ways from hostile foreign forces, similar size economies, fairly similar laws. But Australia in the past 2-3 years has put very rigorous foreign interference laws in place. Australian federal police are, very effective in working with United States law enforcement. And we look at Canada, we can't say the same. So the solution is there's documents in front of Parliament, the sitting government, saying you can do what Australia has done within Canada's legal framework. Go do it. That's the solution. It's as simple as that for me.
Well, Sam, thank you again for joining us. Once again, the book is Wilful Blindness. I'll put a link below, but for anyone watching, where else can they follow you?
They can follow me on Twitter at Scooper Cooper on Twitter, and they can watch for my journalism coming out on the internet, as they say.
All right. Well, thanks. It never feels right to say it's been a pleasure on this podcast. It's been enlightening.
Subject matter.
Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you.
It always amazes me how all these different pieces kind of end up coming together. It is like that conspiracy theory guy, that meme where
I was just thinking about the guy with the
all
thread,
the things, and it comes together, and it's CCP at the center of that.
Oh,
it really is accurate.
I mean, when you're reading the book, it reads like a thriller. You know what I mean? It's just like all this crazy stuff that's happening.
It's about Canada. I tell you what.
I mean, a lot of it goes back to before, any of us were doing reporting on China. It goes back to the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
It's crazy about all the things that had to happen for Vancouver to become this narco hub, essentially. They had to have, suddenly relaxed their immigration standards in the 90s so that you didn't have to have papers to come to Canada, literally. Wow. There's one scene in the book where this guy just flushes his passport down the toilet of the plane because he's like, he can just come and declare who he is and say that he wants to declare refugee status.
Wow.
And then like the thing that Sam was talking about with like suddenly they introduced baccarat and like then they had no limits on the amount of money for high stakes gambling. Just like all these pieces that the CCP then came in and took advantage of.
Jeez.
Yeah, no, it's pretty insane. And also that like the casinos in Canada are run by the government.
Yeah, that's also super weird.
That was weird to me too, but it's essentially through kind of how, U.S. states have those lotteries that are run by states.
Mm-hmm.
So in Canada, their lottery corporations for their provincial governments also run casinos.
I mean, I think it's weird that the lottery in the United States is run by state governments, but,
it's a good way to make money off of
Look, if the government wants to steal our money, they can just raise taxes.
Or create inflation.
Yes, well.
Tax on the lower and middle class.
Just like lotteries.
There we go. It's a perfect system.
Well, casinos apparently is... I mean, even if these guys lose some money at the casinos, right? It's worth it. If you've got to get like $5 million out of China.
Yeah, when you have a $50,000 limit.
Right.
Yeah, and then you got to lose like 1% at a casino in Canada.
I mean, baccarat, you might lose like 2 or 3%.
Yeah.
But that's just like the fee for doing business. Yeah.
I remember us doing this episode about money laundering in Macau through the casinos. Remember this, Matt?
I do remember that because I did most of the writing for that. And when I was researching it, I was kind of shocked at how like they've developed this intricate system of like mainlanders, and they had this kind of like hawala system also where they give money to like a Chinese travel company, and then the travel company gives them like free casino chips, and then the casino chips are used when they get to Macau and they play baccarat, and then they get the money out in Hong Kong dollars or US dollars or British pounds.
Wasn't there like different casino chips that they can exchange them for?
Right. Like there are casino chips that you have to play, and there's casino chips that you can redeem. Like they kind of use that system. Like you buy the casino chips that you have to play, but you can spend as much Chinese RMB as you want on that. Now that system is designed for money laundering through Hong Kong and Macau. But the one that Sam was talking about is money laundering through like directly through criminal it's all criminal, right? But like directly through these organizations where RMB goes in China, Canadian dollars come out in Canada, and then the casinos help you take the bags of dirty cash and pull it out as, legitimate winnings.
I mean, it's so much easier than having to exchange chips and whatever. You just go in with hockey bags of 20s.
That was a very Canadian-specific reference.
Yeah, I mean, that as well. Hockey bags are large, is what I'm getting from that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's just a crazy story that's happening in Vancouver, which you think of as, I mean, have you been to Vancouver?
Yeah, I've been to Vancouver.
I mean, it's basically like San Francisco, right? It's, a beautiful port city, beautiful weather, mild on the West Coast, and you're like, oh yeah, this is a great place to live. And apparently no, it's like the fentanyl capital and narco hub. You just...
A hive of scum and villainy.
And where Meng Wanzhou is currently, waiting out her
I'm
house
sure
arrest.
that's just a coincidence. That's totally not connected in any way.
All of her houses in Vancouver. Yeah.
Definitely no connection at all.
I was thinking about that when he was talking about the Canadian government being weak on Huawei and stuff like, Yeah.
We need to create that conspiracy chart, linking everything up. That actually, that's merchandise right there.
In the book, Sam talks about this police source giving this guy who worked for the casinos this conspiracy chart essentially that had like all the different like tycoons, money laundering kingpins, like
They call it a conspiracy theory until one day it turns out to be investigative journalism.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam, for doing that. It is a fantastic book. I highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah, I can't wait for the Amazon series. They're not going to do that.
No.
They'd have to film it in Vancouver.
Why would they not film in Vancouver?
Oh, I mean, Vancouver is just a place where there's a lot of people go there to film instead of LA
Because
it's
of tax
cheaper.
breaks. Yeah.
Oh, got it.
But, it's not very flattering to Vancouver, is it?
No, perhaps not.
And also, all the Chinese companies that all the people in Hollywood want to do business with. And, okay, here's another conspiracy charge.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We're going to make that, I promise. That's a good one. And today's podcast is sponsored by Daily Peanut. If you're tired of us talking for an hour and want some short, entertaining news stories, subscribe to Daily Peanut. It's a bunch of fast, timely news stories selected for you and available to read on your phone, tablet, or computer. Reading Daily Peanut is an easy way to filter out the noise and learn more about the world news that matters. Join more than 250,000 other readers. Education and entertainment delivered right in your inbox every morning. And the best part is, it's free. So sign up for Daily Peanut now. Use the link in the description below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganejda.
We'll talk to you next time.